Hi everyone, for this lecture we will be looking into the political history of Indonesia, as this is essential in your understanding of the current politics and governance of Indonesia, which we will be looking into later on in your reports. Okay. Alright, so Indonesia class is of course located in Southeast Asia. If you can look at the map, it's below the Philippines and just across Malaysia and Papua New Guinea. It's above, it's above Australia. Indonesia is a constitutional democracy, meaning it practices popular sovereignty, so its officials are elected by the people. So its present constitution has almost made dictatorship impossible, since Indonesia has come under the rule of two dictators. Okay, so let's take a look at the pre-colonial history of Indonesia. Okay, so 1.5 years ago, it was said that the Java man, or Homo erectus, thrived in Indonesia, and in 2000 BCE, Austronesian people arrived in Indonesia from Taiwan. Fast forward to the 7th century, this was a time for the Srivijaya kingdom, and this kingdom has brought Buddhism and Hinduism in Indonesia. So as you all know, Indonesia is one of the most populated Muslim country in the world, but apparently the first religion to thrive in the country was Buddhism, and Hinduism. If you go to the 16th century, this was a time for Islam, the rise of Islam in Java and Sumatra. This was also a century where Europeans came to the country for trade, particularly the trade of spices, right? In the 17th century, the Dutch arrived in 16th actually to the 18th century was the dominance of the Dutch, and Indonesia came, we all know that Indonesia came under the dominance or the rule of the Dutch, right? In the 20th century, so it was a time for the Japanese. Japanese also ruled over Indonesia. They took it over from the Dutch, and when World War II happened and Japan surrendered, 2 days after the bombing of the Nagasaki, Indonesia declared its independence, particularly in 1945. It was also in the 20th century where Indonesia came under the rulership of two dictators, first by Sukarno and followed by the dictator Suharto. So after the rule of these two dictators, forward to the 21st century, this was considered to be a reformasi era for Indonesia. It had its first direct election in 2004, only in 2004. So the 21st century was an era where democratic processes were strengthened in the country. If we go back to the history of Indonesia, let's go to the flourishing of Hinduism and Buddhism. The islands, the Indonesian islands, were ruled by kingdoms and empires, and these islands and kingdoms would sometimes be in a state of war, and also sometimes they would be in a state of unity and peace. Indonesia class is composed of 13,466 islands, and 922 of these islands are permanently inhabited by people. since it's an archipelagic country, it is also connected to trade networks. So it's easy for trade business to occur or to happen, okay, in the area. It is located between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It's also for this reason, because of this reason, that colonizers came to Indonesia. It's because it is accessible. It is the Majapahit Kingdom which brought about the rise of Hinduism and Buddhism in the country. So after this, we had the rule of the Dutch. Indonesia became a colonial state of the Dutch. Sumatra, Java, and the Strait of Malacca are some important aspects of development in the country. It is where development started. It is where colonization started. Okay, so the arrival of Islam started after the decline of the Majapahit Kingdom. Okay, so Islam arrived in the country in the 14th to 15th century, and Malacca was transformed into a sultanate state. Muslim arrived in Malacca. They married locals in there, married women, and they settled also in the archipelago. And since they're businessmen, they're traders, they enjoyed the respect of the people due to their wealth. So they settled in the island until they multiplied. Okay, that's how Islam started in Indonesia. Until today, Islam is the dominant religion in the country, and it's the most populated country with practicing Muslim people. Alright, so let's take a look at the Strait of Malacca, which is near Indonesia. It's between Indonesia and Malaysia. So if you check on it, okay, this is, if you look at the map, this is a shortcut, okay, of going to, if you go from India, and you would take the Strait of Malacca as a shortcut going to China. Okay, it connects the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Yeah, there. It links the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, the other side. So this was a center of trade. Okay. Up until now, this is a busy area. There, right? There's a lot of ships, all kinds of water vessels. Okay, so there was a flourishing of Hinduism and Buddhism. There was the arrival of Islam, and there was the arrival of Europeans. Malacca was conquered in 1511 by the Portuguese, and Malacca became a wealthy location or wealthy island of Indonesia, and the news about the wealth of Malacca has reached the European people. They heard the news about Malacca, and soon enough, the Dutch came, under the guise of the United East India Company, and the Dutch monopolized spice trade in the region. They started to establish their headquarters, which was established in Jakarta. So the Portuguese came, and then the Dutch came. Alright, so the Dutch, the colonization of Indonesia by the Dutch was a slow process. It took 2 centuries, 16th to 18th centuries, and they employed a divide and conquer game. So they would divide the unity of the islands, the people, and they would conquer. They even employed genocide just to take control of the resources of the country. And soon enough, they were able to rule over all of Indonesia. So if we sum that up, we had the flourishing of Hinduism and Buddhism, the arrival of Islam, the arrival of the Europeans. They came under the colonization of the Dutch, and then we had the Japanese invasion. The Japanese became powerful, and then they took over from the Dutch. They took over Indonesia. Let's specifically look at the details of the colonial period of. Okay, the ethical policy. This is a policy which was formulated. This was tried to be implemented by the Dutch because they acknowledge that they have a debt of honor towards the Indonesian. Why? Because they're using their resources, okay, for the personal gain of the Dutch. Okay, they were ripping them off of their resources. Now they felt obligated to raise the living standards of the native Indonesians. So they wanted to improve, to develop Indonesia. Okay, and in order for them to do this, the ethical policy would state that they need to have a direct intervention in the lives of the Indonesians. So they try to intervene in the economic life and the education of the natives. So small Indonesian elite were educated with Western political ideas of freedom and democracy. However, this direct state intervention in the lives of the Indonesian people did not materialize. The Indonesian people still wanted to have a certain identity, and they wanted to rule over their own people. Okay? And every time an attempt of this would happen, the Dutch would stop this attempt. They would resort to repressive or harsh measures. So it was a repressive regime. Okay? Accordingly, the Dutch had a repressive regime in Indonesia. Okay, and because of these harsh measures, they are being stopped of voicing out, having their political voice. We had the birth of Indonesian nationalism. Okay, Indonesian nationalism formally started with the declaration of the Youth Pledge in 1928. Youth Pledge is an organization with three ideals. Okay, one motherland, one nation, and one language for Indonesia. And this organization aims to stimulate the feeling of unity among the youth so that they could fight for their independence. Okay, the declaration of the Youth Pledge in 1928. Okay, this was a conference. Okay, it was where the future national anthem was played, the future national flag was shown, but this was met with suppression from the colonial authorities. So the Dutch did not like this. Alright, it resulted into the arrest and the exile of then youth leader Sukarno, who came to be the first president of Indonesia, together with Muhammad Hatta, the first vice president. So they were youth leaders at that time, and they played an important part in the declaration of the Youth Pledge. They were arrested and exiled, and all the more this angered the Indonesian people, and they clamored. Okay, they clamored for independence. Right, we have Sukarno. He was always in constant conflict with the colonial authorities, with the Dutch. Okay, he was always fighting for nationalism, for independence, and because of this, he would always experience imprisonment. Okay, he experienced multiple imprisonments, and when the Japanese became dominant in the region, he thought of collaborating with the Japanese people so that the Japanese would help them attained independence from the Dutch. Okay, so after the Dutch lost its dominance, okay, the Japanese came. It ruled over Indonesia. However, this resulted in the scarcity of food, clothing, and medicine. There was forced labor, and Java became an island of hunger. However, the one good thing that happened during the Japanese time was Dutch officials being replaced by Indonesian people. So Indonesians were trained and armed by the Japanese government. They were given a political voice, okay? And the Japanese gave full support to the Indonesian nationalist movement after losing World War II. Until the Proclamation of Independence. So Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed the independence of Indonesia on August 17, 1945. This was 2 days after the bombing of the Nagasaki atomic bomb. And the Dutch did not acknowledge this, but due to international pressure, they were forced to acknowledge Indonesia's independence in 1949. Alright, so Sukarno, after the Declaration of Independence, became the first president of Indonesia. So he died at the age of 69. Okay? So he was Indonesia's first president. He ruled for 22 long years. He was considered to be a leading nationalist who devoted his life to the struggle for independence of Indonesia. He was educated in the modern Dutch colonial school. Let's take a look at his old order. So in 1950, Indonesia came under a parliamentary system of government. This government guaranteed individual freedom, and military is only subordinate to civilian leadership. There was no political role for the army, and the role of the president is only ceremonial. The head of state is really the prime minister. During this time, there was a political debate. Okay, Muslim representatives wanted an Islamic state for Indonesia. They wanted Indonesia to be an Islamic state ruled by Sharia law. However, there are also millions of non-Muslim in the country, and Sukarno was thinking they might revolt and might clamor for separation, and this would endanger the unity of Indonesia. This resulted in Sukarno employing Pancasila. Okay, this was declared to be the foundation of the Indonesian state. It has 5 principles: belief in one supreme God, okay, justice and civility among people, the unity of Indonesia, democracy through the liberation and consensus among representatives, and social justice for all the people of Indonesia. This Pancasila philosophy is one of the legacy of Sukarno. But the parliamentary democracy that was employed was characterized by instability. There was always a constant disagreements among political elites. Okay? So the militant wants an Islamic state. They have been employing guerrilla techniques, okay, in order to advance this want. And Sukarno was forced to use the military. Okay, as there was also military movements demanding for political and economic reform. Became a dictator. Okay, they had their first general election in 1955. So it took more than 40 years before Indonesia witnessed another example of fair and free election in 2004. So because of that instability under the parliamentary government, there was a return to the 1945 constitution. So more power was given to the president and the army. And this paved the way for a strong presidency with authoritarian tendencies. Sukarno disbanded the parliament. He dissolved the parliament and appointed new members. And he was always in constant military confrontation towards Malaysia. Nag-aaway sila ni Malaysia. His policies were also anti-Western. Okay? He withdrew from the United Nations membership. He withdrew from the IMF and World Bank. So this has caused loss of support from this international organization. So naturally, foreign aid will not flow in the country because of this withdrawal. So development became difficult for Indonesia. They were struggling economically, okay, until a mysterious coup d'etat happened in September 30, 1965, where army generals were killed, and this left Suharto to be the highest ranking general. So he killed his superiors and took control of the army, and then he declared Indonesia under a state of martial law. So with this declaration, he placed Sukarno under house arrest until his death in 1970. Suharto, became the second dictator of Indonesia. Sukarno transferred the Super Summer document, which was signed by him, transferring executive power to Suharto. And Suharto was formally named acting president in 1967 and inducted as Indonesia's second president in 1968. Okay, so during Suharto's regime, there was an emphasis on economic development. Alright, there was restoration of ties with the West because Sukarno previously had an anti-Western policy. So when Suharto came, he restored ties with the West, and this enabled the flow of much needed foreign aid to Indonesia. So he also employed prudent fiscal management, and the costly military confrontation towards Malaysia were stopped, right? So his new order emphasized on economic development and restoration with the West, prudent fiscal management. We also had the Golkar. This was powerful parliamentary vehicle for Suharto. This is a movement, or an activity which promotes the central government. So the aim of Golkar is to produce a majority for the government from the grassroots. There was also more restrictive measures on foreign investment and preferential policies favoring indigenous businessmen. So during the time of Suharto, he implemented policies that favors indigenous businessmen, because these indigenous businessmen started to complain that foreigners were enjoying preferential treatment from the government, and they are being overlooked. So Suharto implemented preferential policies towards these indigenous businessmen. It was also during his time where Indonesia invaded East Timor, and money which came from the oil resources of Indonesia, were spent on development of infrastructures and poverty alleviation programs, meaning the programs that would alleviate poverty, that would improve the lives of the Indonesian people. He also adopted the Pancasila principles that were established during the time of Sukarno. So, however, it became a tool for repressing organizations. So, whenever organizations would complain, would make movements, would protest, they would be accused of going against the Pancasila principle. They would be accused of destroying the unity of the Indonesian people. And the army was always there to implement Suharto's policy. So he was also a dictator. The new order of Suharto was successful. Okay, his legitimacy, he, the his legitimacy was that of an impressive economic development for Indonesia. There was a rise in the number of educated Indonesians. Investments kept flowing in the country, okay, which resulted into employment of Indonesians. Indonesia in the 1990s was labeled as an East Asian miracle, an Asian tiger, and a high-performing Asian economy. This was because of Suharto's new order. During Suharto's time, human rights were not always respected. That's because the government was always suppressing anti-government movements. But it has been said that this has kept the unity of the Indonesian people, and this was helpful in alleviating the millions of people out of poverty, because there was little room for dissent, there was little room for protest in policy making, so it was easy to implement the policy of the national government. Suharto's style of rule is also that of political patronage system. So in exchange for electoral support, he would often buy his critics by providing them with good government positions or investment opportunities. Okay. Then we had the Asian financial crisis in 1997 to 1998. Indonesia was greatly affected by this Asian financial crisis. So much of the social and economic achievements that were done during the time of Suharto were undone. Indonesian people became more determined for a new government as they experienced the crisis. There were riots in Jakarta. More than 1,000 people were killed. This has caused Suharto to resign. And then, Vice President Habibie became Indonesia's third president on May 1998. This ushered to the era of Reformation, or the Reformasi era in the 21st century. Okay. After Suharto, was a period of democracy, with open and liberal politics. There was decentralization of power away from the national government to the regions, and there was a transfer of administrative powers, which were then concentrated in the central government to the regional districts. Okay, so this caused regional violence as local politicians would compete for power in the region. So yun lang ang bad side naman ng decentralization. During the Reformation in Indonesia, freedom of the press was also introduced, and parties and unions were allowed to be established. There were release of political prisoners, and the presidency was limited to 2 terms of 5 years. Okay. And then there was the scheduling of a general election. Alright, so that's about it for the political history of Indonesia. So we will be looking into the current government of Indonesia in our next discussion.